My name is Tom Dixon. I'm the Vice President for the Australian Institute of International Affairs in New South Wales. And we have a great panel this afternoon to talk to a number of different domains in new technology. So I'll briefly introduce everyone. We have Dr. Ann Ali, Labor Federal Member for Cowering, who will speak to Australia's approach to countering violent extremism in social media. I have Dr. Alan Ryan from the Australian Civil Military Centre, who will talk to new technologies in conflict. Dr. Darren Lim from ANU, who will talk to new technologies in international trade. And Aidan Tudhope, co-founder of Macquarie Telecom, who will talk to information security. Now we have 8 minutes each to initially talk, and I've just been given a silver bell, so I'm sure we'll stick to time. Anne, would you give us a pleasure?
Thank you. Okay, I'm gonna make 4 key points and hopefully do them in less than 8 minutes. But can I first of all thank you for inviting me here and getting me out of question time? I'll keep the facial expressions just so that you'll don't feel like you're left out of question time. So I'm going to make 4 key points about violent extremism on the internet and social media. And the first point that I want to make is that the role of the internet in violent extremism still is not fully understood. And it's still quite contentious. In fact, you'll hear a lot of assumptions about the role of the internet in violent extremism, and particularly in radicalisation, where you'll hear people say things like, "Oh, he was rapidly radicalised, self-radicalised online." Those kinds of assumptions actually have no basis in evidence. And in fact, a RAND report tested 5 of the assumptions that are made about the internet and radicalisation to violent extremism and found that most of them did not hold. At very best, we can say that the internet acts as an echo chamber for people who have a certain worldview to find people of like-minded worldviews and to reinforce those worldviews. And the other thing that it does is provide opportunities for people to become radicalised towards violent extremism. Now, moving on from that, the second point that I would make is based on the research that I did before becoming distracted by a political career. And that was looking at online behaviours and whether or not there are telltale signs in online behaviours that might point to particular trajectories towards violent extremism. And a bit of background about how that research was conducted was I was in Washington and I got a phone call from a family whose son had gone to fight for ISIS. And I said, "Look, I'm in Washington at the moment. I'll be back in 4 days. I'll meet you when I get back." When they told me his name, I thought that name sounds very, very familiar. So I went onto my computer and I'd taken snapshots of Facebook conversations that I had been having and that other people had been having with a group of young men in WA. And sure enough, there was this young fellow with his name stating quite clearly for the last 4 months and quite repeatedly that he had every intention of going overseas to join ISIS and fight. That got me looking at other research that showed that post a terrorist attack, there's often telltale signs on social media, leakage, fixation, etc. And from there, we did some research based in the UK, and in the period of 6 months doing that research, managed to stop 5 potential terrorist plots. The progression that we marked or laid out from based on online behaviours starts with the seeker, that is somebody who's seeking to have a question answered, the same reason that any of us go on the internet, whether it's to look for a pizza place or to, Dr. Google to look up symptoms, which I don't recommend that you do, but do as I say, not as I do. From there, the next behavioural profile is the lurker, who quietly kind of observes different kinds of what we might call radical or extremist websites. The inquirer then starts taking a participatory role in these websites. The advocate becomes the cheerleader and can also become a recruiter, and the activator is somebody who is ready, primed and prepared to undertake a physical attack. Last month, I think it was, or the month before that, I went to New Zealand to address the Royal Commission into the Christchurch attacks and their Office of Film and Literature Classification. And as you'll know, New Zealand, immediately after the Christchurch attacks, passed a law that prohibited the sharing of the video and any other kind of content. And we spoke about the limitations of that law in New Zealand, particularly because it cannot stop content that is shared by somebody outside of New Zealand. Australia has one of the broadest suites of laws relating to terrorism of any Western country. We have laws relating to, we recently passed the temporary exclusion orders relating to returning jihadists. We have laws about online content. We have laws about preparing. We have laws about undertaking activities related to terrorism. But we need to have a recognition of the limitations of those laws. And the fact that laws actually don't change behaviour. What we're dealing with here is behaviour. So what can we do better in terms of changing behaviour? In relation to those laws, and particularly the laws that New Zealand has passed, we've also had a push in regards to, or the approach that we've had in regards to social media and the internet and violent extremism has been to talk to the social media platforms and media companies about taking down content. Now, again, before I was distracted by politics, I did a project for Google at their behest, which actually looked at content and looked at how people interact with content to understand whether or not it was worthwhile, if it was actually effective and worthwhile taking content down. And what we found with this project is that actually some content actually generates really important discussions that can change people's thinking. It's discussions that are needed to engage people who are going through that process, where they're the seeker or the lurker or the inquirer, that may be forms of early intervention and lead them away from a pathway towards violence and towards violent extremism. So one of the limitations of requiring social media companies to take down content, there are two limitations that I want to talk to. The first one is what it does is that it is actually kind of a whack-a-mole approach. So you knock down one website, or you knock down one Facebook page, or you knock down one account, another one pops up in its place. And so you find then an intensive amount of resources is being used to take down content, but it actually doesn't change the behaviour of putting content up, or change the behaviours of seeking content, lurking around content, becoming fixated with causes, leakage, all of those behaviours that we highlighted in the research that we did on online behaviours towards violent extremism. The second point that I want to make about taking down content is that we've seen a movement of terrorism, transnational organised crime, away from open source information, away from open source media platforms to the dark net and the dark web. Telegram, for example, had an increase of 600 new accounts related to ISIS in a single month alone. On online gaming, you have the formation of a subculture of white supremacist, violent, alt-right type movements, all operating in the dark spaces of the internet, away from law enforcement, away from capabilities to actually detect or even engage with people who may be headed down that path, who are showing signs of becoming fixated with a particular cause, who are showing signs of internalising a worldview that could lead to a violent act and violent extremism. So the removal of content on open source data has two effects. It drives content to the dark web, where it is much harder to detect and engage with, but it also deals with perhaps the volume of content at any single time, but not the overall regeneration of content and the regeneration of ideas. And I can come back to my first point there about the internet being an echo chamber, an enabler, and providing opportunities for people to become radicalised towards violent extremist ideologies. The last point that I want to make, how far am I in?
1 minute over, but we can have...
Oh, okay. The last point is a 30-second point, and that is just that we need a lot more international coordination, and that international coordination needs to go beyond just taking down content, but also if we're going to have laws in one country that don't affect the sharing of content in another country, it really does render those laws, if not ineffective, at least limited in their effectiveness. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne. Now, Alan.
Right. I still own a suit that I bought in 2003, but at that time I was operating a Nokia 1100, which some of you might remember, and at that stage I thought I was at the cutting edge of technology. The point that I'd like to make by that is that the exponential growth of the impact of technology is leaving us in an odd situation where some aspects of conflict, namely the fact that it is often violent by its nature, and involves the conflict of wills, will remain as they always have been, but other aspects are going to effectively be black swans. We don't know what the future of conflict, in fact, what the conflicts that are being fought out at the very moment will exactly look like. So a key tool for us is to appreciate not only the possibilities of technology-enabled conflict, but also to start thinking about the way that we work in our daily lives. So what I'd like to do is to spend the next little while to consider a couple of key points and then perhaps a couple of considerations about the nature of conflict as we see it now. So first of all, strategy is effectively the applications of ends, ways and means. Technology is fundamentally about ways and means, but absent a strategic framework, it's just that, it's technology. Secondly, we need to learn to incorporate a consideration of the application of emerging technologies in all of our strategic thinking. New technologies can offer the possibility of discrimination, limited collateral damage, reduction of risk. We hear quite a lot about that. But if the past has taught us anything, it is that technology is a two-edged sword and that it offers our opponents the ability to tackle our vulnerabilities. Thirdly, digitisation has levelled the playing field. States and wealthy industrial states no longer necessarily possess the capability, edge or monopoly over access to information and intelligence. Information has become remarkably cheap, and it comes down to the fact that we have access to this ubiquitous technology. We live in an age of integrated, independent systems. But our decision-making processes remain largely hierarchical, stovepiped, and largely non-expert. There has been a rejection of expertise at the very time that we need to get a lot better at accessing diverse, connected expertise and putting experts together to create rapid, adaptive responses to problems. So a few considerations. One of the things that has changed since 2003 has been the way that the fourth industrial revolution has burst on us. We're now seeing a fusion of technologies blurring the lines between physical, digital and biological spheres. And the fourth industrial revolution effectively refers to the combination of the effects of artificial intelligence, machine learning, quantum computing, robotics, drone technology and digitisation. The reality is that we're facing is that the pace of change is mirroring Moore's law. Digital capability develops exponentially, meaning that we struggle to keep pace with the application of integrated technologies, particularly that our command and control systems, our bureaucratic structures and our political systems are better suited to the industrial age. In government, decision-making is still largely conducted in vertical hierarchies, whereas the problem that we face is not organised by portfolios. And I would refer you to the work that Stanley McChrystal's done in his work Team of Teams. It's a fairly populist sort of document, but it's an easy read demonstrating the problems that those who are waging conflict face when they're dealing with complex adaptive opponents who may not necessarily be state-based. Similarly, many of you will be aware of the book Ghost Fleet by P.W. Singer, where he painted an image of a conflict that starts with a massive integrated computer attack and the impact that it could have on an advanced state. And I'll continue to refer to some of these popular culture images because I think they're actually quite important. The second consideration I'd like to raise is the issue of complex autonomous systems. Some of you may have seen the video Slaughterbots. If not, Google it and have a look at it. It's a particularly interesting alternative future looking at the issue of targeting using essentially small drones to carry out independent assaults on a range of targets. The point is that you can program an array of technology nowadays to target specific characteristics, and a lot of people are particularly concerned about the impact that this will have on the way that conflict is waged. But of course, with any form of artificial intelligence as it's applied, it's really only as good as the data that feeds it. Robotics. For some people who may have attended the recent Army Open Day that was held here in Canberra a couple of weeks ago, it was quite terrifying how fast things have moved in terms of the technologies that are available to us and, of course, to others. Robotics provide the ability to exercise discrimination and standoff lethality in complex urban terrain. Jim Mattis, former Secretary of Defence, former Marine Corps General who commanded the assault on Fallujah, spoke about the issues that he faced of hazarding troops in house-to-house fighting and the fact that robotics would actually provide the potential to limit civilian casualties. But of course, the problem we face is that manned systems, fighter aircraft, combat ships, submersibles, are rapidly losing value as uncrewed systems can do their tasks longer, cheaper, and more safely for the operators. A lot of people will think about drone strikes and global reach when they think about technology. Many of you have probably seen the, I think, very good Helen Mirren film, Eye in the Sky, which shows the potential now for standoff capability, the ability to loiter over targets globally for extended periods, and the fact that many of these operations are commanded on the other side of the globe from where the impact finally occurs. One of the problems, of course, that we're facing is the impossibility of excluding civilian casualties. David Kilcullen wrote an article 10 years ago in which he pointed out that drone attacks create a sense of insecurity amongst militants and constrain their interactions with suspected informers. But because they kill remotely, drone strikes avoid American casualties. So what's to argue with that? Then he pointed out that press reports suggest that over the past 3 years, drone strikes have killed about 14 terrorist leaders. That's 14. But according to Pakistani sources, they have also killed some 700 civilians. This is 50 civilians for every militant killed, a hit rate of 2%, hardly precision. American officials vehemently dispute these figures, and it is likely that more militants and fewer civilians have been killed than is reported by the press. Nevertheless, every one of these dead non-combatants represents an alienated family, a new desire for revenge, and more recruits for a militant movement that has grown exponentially even as drone strikes have increased. So the impact of conflict is not necessarily that which we expect when we have resort to technological ends. Cyber war, of course, has become not just the province of state actors, but it contains the potential to target the very foundations of modern society: banking, logistics, computer-enabled systems, including transport, and utilities such as gas and electricity. And the question we've got to ask ourselves is how long would we last if our banking system went down? I can assure you, I have no cash in here. I'd be in trouble very, very quickly. War obviously is extremely unpleasant, and we in the developed world have become used to being insulated from the violence that characterised total war in the 20th century. It is entirely possible that we could lose this protection, and it's impossible to fully protect against technologies that we may be unaware of. We need to build greater resilience into our systems, and in government we need to do this through more challenging national exercises, the application of integrated thinking to strategy, policy, multi-agency planning and operational execution. We need to stop thinking in departmental stovepipes, and we need to start behaving as if we belong in the information age. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan. Now, Darren.
Thanks, Tom, and thank you to the AAAA for the invitation. My brief is to talk about technology and its impact on international trade. I'm going to make 3 points. My first one could be seen as a bit of a trite one, but I think it's important to make the comparison. And so that point is that trade in this era of advanced technology poses very different policy challenges to trade in previous eras. As our national anthem reminds us, we are girt by sea. And that fact, historically, really simplified our trade policy because trade was conducted first via ports and then via airports. And the benefit of ports and airports is that they're physical things. You can train a customs official to physically stand there and look at everything that's coming through, going in and out, to make sure that it's compliant with Australian laws and does not pose any undue risks. And if you've ever tried to go through the airport with dirty boots, you'll know how efficient our customs people are at removing that particular threat to our biosphere. But, when we're thinking about trade in the 21st century and, all sorts of exchanges in goods and services and indeed information, we aren't girt by sea anymore. We're girt by cyber. We're girt by a digital world. And so the problem is that it's very difficult to direct flows of trade and I think international exchange more broadly into trade in the digital domain into trusted gateways, the way that we can divert trade into ports and airports. So the conditions that made old-fashioned trade safe and secure don't apply anymore. And indeed, even trade in physical goods itself is a more fraught process because technology is very complicated. There can be things inside the physical good that we can't see, that we can't just open it up and check that it's okay. So to conclude this point, I think right now, and I think this is a theme that is consistent through all the speakers so far, there is certainly a lot of uncertainty, but also maybe even impotence that politicians and bureaucrats are feeling now. They're not used to this kind of feeling when thinking about their regulatory capacity in this space. Point number 2 then is that the political consequence of this, the political consequence of trade in an era of advanced technology, is that trade policy choices are now impossible to separate from national security concerns and great power politics. I'm an academic, I'm a social scientist, and I study political economy, and I can tell you that whether you're a political scientist or an economist, when we used to study political economy, it was very easy. We have these standard theoretical models that we use to understand the drivers of trade policy. In the simplest terms, the models are about vested interests and lobby groups. You'd identify the winners and losers from a given trade policy, and you'd work out who had more political power, and then you would use that to predict the trade policy choices of a given country. Would it be more or less open or closed? And those were easy. Interest group politics is fairly clean to understand. We can see what everyone's interests are, and if we know something about how politics works in a given country, you can have a decent idea of what's going to happen, how the debate, how the politics is going to play out. But trade in an era of high technology goods isn't nearly as straightforward because increasingly governments are being asked or are choosing to link these products to national security concerns. And using national security concerns to interfere with or indeed outright stop flows of goods and services and capital and even people and of course information. And this isn't new. Governments have been using national security justifications in the past to interfere with trade, but it used to be a lot more simple. Back in the Cold War, the US had an Export Control Act, and if there was a given widget that could somehow be used in the production of an ICBM missile, you didn't sell to the Soviets. It was pretty easy, right? And the problem is that widgets these days are far broader in how they can be used. There's a lot more dual-use technology these days. You know, technologies that have consumer applications, like the iPhone, you know, can more and more, in an increasing breadth of scope, can be adapted to provide a battlefield advantage, which again complicates how we regulate trade given national security. And moreover, security isn't just about building ICBMs, it's not just about bombs and bullets. Security now means infrastructure, it means the functioning of our political institutions, it means, you know, security can be about repression and using technology as an instrument of repression. So all of these different justifications can be used by governments to interfere with the market, to interfere with the flows of trade in goods and services, etc. But on what basis are they going to make those choices? You know, it's very hard to predict or understand, to model, as an academic I want to do, how they're going to make those choices. You know, as an observer, to me, it seems like governments are kind of making it up as they go along, and so it's very hard for me, observing them as a social scientist gazing down from my ivory tower, to work out exactly what's going on. And then, of course, you add US-China rivalry to that from this morning's session, and it makes things even that much more complicated, that much more acute, and that much more variable. And that leads to my third and final point, which is that the policy consequences of this are going to be very variable and, you know, dependent, I think, on measurement. So, you know, we heard, given that national security is overshadowing economic policy and governments are responding to perceived vulnerabilities, there is a lot of variation in those vulnerabilities. You know, here in Australia and in the United States, we are worried about what happens if we don't impose barriers to technology, if we don't try to control some of those flows. But as we heard this morning, the point that James made, China is worried about what happens if barriers are imposed. You know, if its technology and development policies are constrained, you know, it can perceive that as containment and see that as a very significant national security risk. So the vulnerabilities are going in different directions. Now, of course, if barriers are imposed and where barriers are imposed and markets are crimped in some way, that of course means less trade, it means less exchange, and that has material losses associated with it. But it also has diplomatic losses. You know, there was a talk this morning about the costs of undoing interdependence, of decoupling, but given that trade has been such a stabiliser for world politics over the past 50, 60 years. And then there are also social risks. The pressure on societies from trying to decide what types of trade are acceptable and what trades are not, what types are not. Now they're the costs associated with imposing barriers, and then you've got to balance those against the costs of not imposing barriers. You know, national security risks to sovereignty, to political autonomy, to democratic freedoms. You know, just need to look at the 2016 US election to see how those costs can manifest and play out. So the policy challenge for governments, but for all of us trying to understand this, is how do we evaluate or compare the relative benefits and costs of openness versus closure? And this is a question that I don't have an answer to, that I'm really throwing out for all of you to consider. All I would say is that it does depend on questions of measurement. You know, good policy requires us to be able to understand what those benefits and costs are and to compare them with each other. And it's such a difficult, you know, task these days to try to quantify in some sense, with some consistency, what those benefits and costs are. And so I think, and my final point here is that measurement is going to play an increasingly important role in deciding what the optimal policy strategies are. Thanks.
Now, Aidan.
Great. Good afternoon, thank you. It's hard to believe that the internet is just 30 years old. Something that has so profoundly changed all our lives as well as what we know as in society. But interestingly, we haven't been thinking about cybersecurity for those 30 years. It's been in the last 5 years it's moved out of the technical domain, the niche defence realm, into mainstream media and mainstream life. In the last 5 years, as citizens and individuals, we've all become very aware of the risks that are imposed or that are exposed by the internet. Whether it's the systems we're using, whether it's our financial information, health, tax records, military, or even potentially bringing society to a halt. The question that couches the points I want to leave and open up to the discussion with this panel is, why is it just in the last 5 years? Why are we now talking about technology? Why is it that the AIIA conference now has technology as its number 2 panel? That's not the case only a short number of years ago. And to build that up, oh, there goes the name tag. The first bit is that it's a utility. The internet has become a utility like power and water. It's displaced the telephone. We can do without the telephone. We can't do without the internet. It underpins everything we do in our life and in the economy. And it's not just that connectivity piece, it's the data that underpins what we're doing on the internet. And you may have heard in more recent times we talk about data as being the new currency. And when we start thinking about foreign affairs, data is a new currency. It is highly valuable, and as a nation, and when we're thinking about our foreign affairs policy, we should be thinking about how we're protecting the nation's data, not in collective, but individually as well as a collective. We've all seen the hacks. They're thick and fast. In this country, we now have a notifiable data breach regime where if you're a business and you disclose private information, you need to disclose it to the Privacy Commission. There is a breach notified to the Commission 3 times every single day since that framework has been put in place just over 18 months ago. 3 every single day. And they're the ones that did report. They're the ones that felt compelled, and they're the ones that are captured by the framework. The government's referenced recently $2.3 billion impact in 2017 on cyber losses. It's very, very significant. But of course, it's not just the technology and the data, it's the way it's all connected. And it's the connectivity piece and the sharing and the augmenting that we're doing to that data that is transforming our lives. But it's also transforming the hackers. They're after those data sets, and they're after how those data sets are evolving and are influencing increasingly our life. And that brings me to my 4 points. Because it's about data, because it's about our connected lifestyles, cybersecurity is all about the weakest link. There's no use saying that the Department of Defence has cybersecurity all battened down if another agency is leaving their front door wide open, because that front door creates a back door to those secure agencies. We need to think about our supply chain. We need to think about who is securing government, who is securing business, who are we trusting if we're going to raise that cybersecurity bar. And because the infrastructure is in private hands, companies like Macquarie Telecom, it's a new domain for the intelligence communities. The infrastructure is in private hands. Government policy, of course, being set by the government. And so for the first time, I would suggest government now needs to work with the private sector if we're going to secure their systems and the nations at large. My second point is, in setting the fact that we have, talking about the lowest common denominator, we actually have to define what I call the plimsoll line. I'm a sailor. For those that are in the world of sailing, the plimsoll line is primarily on container ships. If the boat is overladen and you fall below that line, the boat is at risk of sinking. And we need to define what that is, and we need to have absolutely zero tolerance, just like what we do with occupational health and safety. We must absolutely at all times make sure we're above that bar. The third point I want to make is, if we're actually going to have our place, not just securing Australia, but helping the region, we need great skills here. We need sovereign capabilities. We can't rely on the technology nations that we've been relying on in the past. we actually need to build up our own skills. We need to start with STEM education, getting young boys and girls seeing cybersecurity as a domain that they want to make part of their career and their profession. We can't outsource it. We certainly can't outsource it to the low-cost labour jurisdictions. And my final point I'll leave with you is we have a role in this region. If you look about our neighbouring nations, there aren't cybersecurity experts in large numbers. Not only do we need those sovereign capabilities for ourselves, but we need to actually use it so we can influence the nations above us so that they also don't become the weakest link and undermine the values of society that we so value and hold dear. So thank you, and thank you AIIA for introducing technology to this national conference. I think you will see it increasingly so over future years. Back to you, Tom.
Thank you very much, Aidan. Now I'll have a quick question for each of you, and then we'll throw it open for questions from everyone. So, Anne, what I'm interested in is the word agency has come up a lot today. And I was wondering if you could speak to the agency of social media platforms. What are they doing? What can they do? And what should they be doing in relation to countering violent extremism?
Thank you for that. Thank you for that question, Tom. And, contrary to, I think, the impression that it is out there, some social media companies are actually doing quite a bit. Google is very, very active, I must say. I've done a lot of work with Google and with young people where Google has put on forums. In 2015, I took a couple of young people to Japan with me to do a Google workshop around challenging online hate using social media. So I think Google does a lot. If I can say Facebook, I think, has some way to go. They have their reporting measures, but they are not adequately resourced to deal with taking down offensive material. I think... And I spoke in my 8 minutes about the limitations of this approach of them taking down offensive material, the limitations in terms of legislative jurisdictions, but also in terms of its impact and effectiveness on actual behaviours. I think a better way that they can be combating this is through things like, for example, a Google algorithm. So if somebody, as I mentioned, all behaviours start with a seeking behaviour. So somebody gets in there and starts Googling white rabbit, for example, which is a popular white supremacist trope, that rather than sending them to a white supremacist website, it sends them to a website that's set up and managed by one of the exit groups. And exit groups exist in many countries around the world to help people leave radical or extremist ideological groups. So I think that apart from the approach of just this kind of big stick legislative taking it down, there are a whole range of other strategies that I think are more impactful and more effective.
Thank you very much. Alan, I want to pick up on a question that you posed, which was how do we incorporate thinking about emerging technology into strategic thinking? Can you continue to elaborate on how we might actually achieve that?
Well, one of the reasons you have me up here is not because I'm an expert on technology. I'm an historian and a lawyer, so I know very little about it. That being said, my centre, the Australian Civil Military Centre, actually has the task of assisting Australian government agencies to work together better to prepare for conflict and disaster overseas. And one of the things that we're seeing is this issue that we continue largely just stovepipe problem solving in portfolios. Now, as we have in the past, if we need to deal with something in an interagency context, we'll have a committee, we'll have a meeting, we'll get people together, and this will roll out over months. What we're saying is that you can't do that anymore. And certainly if you look at the Thodey report, which has gone to the Prime Minister and hopefully we'll see released very, very soon, the interim report there was really reflecting on the fact that we might have the technology, and the technology is going to take us where the technology does, but our human systems and the relationships that we have across government aren't really keeping pace with that. So our argument is that we need some fairly radical thinking about the way that we interact at the bureaucracy political level, at the civil military level, at the private sector to the public sector level, and also look at all of those other groups, the academic groups and the like, who are fundamentally part of this great integrated endeavour that we're effectively all embarked on in our lives, but which we continue to see perhaps in more fragmented and old-style disciplinary ways.
Thank you very much. Now, Darren, I wanted to ask you another agency-related question. What is Australia's agency in relation to US-China technological competition, and how can we influence outcomes, or can we influence outcomes?
That's a very good question. There's sort of this irony wrapped up in my discussion. We talked this morning, and I mentioned to just then about sort of the commercial peace thesis, the idea that trade and commercial relations between countries are a force for peace and a force for good, because they create interests on both sides that are vested in having a positive relationship so everyone can get richer, and that's a powerful dampener to war. But as I sort of tried to make the point in my presentation, interdependence in the 21st century is now a source of fear. It's now a source of insecurity, because in creating those connections, we are creating vulnerabilities that can be exploited by people who want to create mischief. And that, of course, fear is a very powerful policy driver. And when you are responding to fear, that often can create cycles or spirals that lead to conflict. And so it's now possible that the vulnerabilities that have been created by interdependence are actually a source of conflict in the relationship, rather than, or in addition to being a source of peace. And so how do you strike that balance? And I think that no one knows the answer to that. And so any country or any thinker who can try to sort of create a model of the world in which the benefits of interdependence can be preserved while removing the sources of fear that's going to be a significant contributor to stabilising relations between the two countries. And to create, to put out an argument that's been made that I think is quite provocative, that might require some degree of decoupling between the two large economies. You might need to remove some of the most significant sources of fear in order to stabilise or reach some kind of political equilibrium in the relationship. And so it's not just Australia, anyone who can come up with a good idea of how you could do that, that could be a major contribution.
Thank you. Now, Aidan, I wanted to ask you, you brought up private hands, national interest, and the difference between those. And so businesses and the community are often the front line for the cyber domain. How does the Australian government reconcile the national interests with those private interests and work with them?
I think it's a real challenge around the world. Businesses are there primarily for their shareholders and stakeholders. Their interests may not be aligned with what the government of the day is trying to prosecute. You need to look at other domains like energy, power and gas, and you can sort of see that challenge there. In technology, you then add the dimension of where those entities perhaps are located, or head office is located. You get a new dimension. It covers what Anne covered, where you've got US social media outlets. How aligned will they be with the government, the Australian government's approach here? It's really challenged. The bit that sort of, I guess, I take with me from a dialogue that I had, I was part of the Australia-US cybersecurity dialogue that Malcolm Turnbull established with Obama now a number of years ago. And one of the things I remember very vividly there is the only way we're going to get the private sector and the public sector or governments to work together on the cybersecurity front if there's a genuine two-way sharing of information. There's benefit to both sides. And that was really challenged because those around the room, particularly those that were from the intelligence communities, as it is the case here in Australia, where the mantra is keeping our secrets close and exposing other secrets, is at odds with information sharing. But that's what we need. We need to be able to share within obviously a defined grouping, increasing volumes of information, because it's only through mutual benefit will there ever be a dialogue. You sort of don't engage the Australian Cybersecurity Centre to help you if you've been breached unless you think that they're going to help you, right? Or you have a legal obligation. And I use as an example to say it relies on both government and the private sector to work together, and making sure that those that are in the private sector are sovereignty aligned, which in my view feeds back to we need to make sure we have a strong technology sector here in Australia that are going to be far more aligned with the Australian government than perhaps maybe where their head offices are headquartered, which may add new conflicts.
Thank you very much. Now we have until 3 o'clock for questions from the audience. So if you could raise your hand and let me know that you're interested, and then please state your name and then ask your question short and sharp. Over here.
Thank you. I'm Ian Lincoln, the President of the Institute in New South Wales. As a graduate in history, politics and psychology, I hesitate to ask a question about psychology, but Alan, you've emboldened me, so here goes. A lot of the focus in what you've been saying, at least until Alden's answer to the last question, has been on an international security focus as seen by government, including, I think, a sense of a new kind of competition for access to technology beneficial to economic development, and I'm thinking there of China. I'm wondering if there's another dimension, though, arising from private ownership of intellectual property in such areas as industrial technology and medical applications. Is excess private ownership of new technology a threat to fairness, to equity in the international system, and thus a threat to international stability?
Who would like to take that one?
I'm happy to make a small stab at it. Look, one of the things I'd say is that one of the problems that we in Canberra have, and certainly we public servants, is that we do tend to see things very largely from the perspective of government. I think the reality is that most activity is in the private sector. And so, yes, we'll certainly look at it from the lens of the responsibilities and the decision rights that we've got, but we also have to recognise the fact that much of what goes on in the world in which we live in is, if not beyond our control, it's not something that we necessarily have the decision rights over, and we need to learn to live with that.
It probably won't answer your question directly, but I can make the following observation, which is that there is, I think, an interesting tension at the moment on the proper role for the state in regulating technology and international trade. And there's a long history of the debate between states and markets. What role should states play? What role should we leave to the market? And I think that there are two major pressures at the moment which are bolstering the case for the state. The first is the rise of China and the presentation of what many see as a credible model of economic organisation and politics, I suppose. And the second is anti-establishment disaffectedness within the West, coming out of the global financial crisis and a general sort of malaise in the West, in which people think that sort of the neoliberal model isn't working and are looking for alternatives. And both those pressures are advancing the state, I think, are pushing the state forward as being needing to play a much more prominent role in regulating society and in regulating affairs of international affairs. And so I think that's you will see a movement in that direction. Inequality, arguably as well, is being seen as a justification for greater state intervention. If you look at the debates in the US, indeed speeches that have been made here, inequality is seen as a driver as well. So I think that's where we're going.
Anyone else? No? Okay, back to the floor. We have one directly down the front, and then I'm going to the flanks.
Hi, my name is Anjali and I'm a Bachelor of Law and Bachelor of Arts student from Macquarie Uni and a NCP scholar. And I have a question in relation to what Dr. Alan Ryan was talking about with complex autonomous systems. Because in 2017, the Conventional Weapons Group of Governmental Experts sought a clear binding rules to stigmatize autonomous weapon systems and argued for a ban treaty as being imperative to retain meaningful human control over the use of force, including selecting and engaging targets. Do you think that a blanket ban will stifle the humanitarian potential and benefits of autonomous weapon systems by minimising casualties in conflict? And if not, how should policymakers deal with emerging technologies within the area of lethal autonomous weapon systems? Thanks.
I'm not entirely sure that I'm the person in government to answer that question. What I would say is that the international legal regime and the technology are probably two quite discrete things. And in terms of the use of any weapons system, I think the principle has always been to, in international law, to restrain and constrain the impacts of these technologies. And we're now in slightly uncharted waters, given that people aren't quite sure how far you can go. The argument that I made that the weapons are only as good as the data sets that are fed into them in the first instance means that ultimately there is a person in the loop at some stage. What I would say, though, is that I fear the genie is out of the bottle in terms of the technology. It's cheap, it's ubiquitous, it's already being used by non-state groups. As time goes on, it will continue to be weaponised, and we're just going to have to learn the world that we're going to be operating in is going to have to come up with counter systems, and it's a part of the reality that we exist in already. So by all means, a legal regime that will mitigate, ameliorate and prevent the use of different forms of weapon systems is probably where we will go, but at the same time, I'm not entirely sure we're going to see the systems being shut down.
I might turn that into a question for the rest of the panel broadly about international law and treaty negotiation, how it's relevant to each of the areas that you spoke about. So, Anne?
I just wanted to make a point on that as well, because I don't think, again, it's just about legislation. We have and have had for a long time now rules of engagement in war. We've got the just war principles, we've got the Geneva Convention, etc. One of the things that the new kind of international security landscape, or the contemporary context of international security that we have now, is that the biggest threat is no longer state-on-state conflict. It's conflict between states, individuals are big players in this, non-state actors, and proxies are big players now in the international security environment. And I don't think that our international standards and agreed standards for the conduct of war have necessarily kept up with the new international security context, nor the context of technology in warfare either. I think the most telling part of that is the fact that we made the mistake, and I say we being Western nations, but I don't necessarily include myself in that, but anyway, as that part of that, we made the mistake of thinking that terrorism could be eradicated through conventional military means alone, when in fact the so-called war on terror actually increased the proliferation of terrorism by, at best guess, 400%, and that's a very conservative guess there. So our approach to the current international security environment, where we've got all of these kinds of novel novel in terms of modern type, dissident actors, proxy wars, new technologies, the use of technologies, low-tech terrorism conducted by dissident actors, individual kind of lone actor, lone wolf terrorism. All of these things haven't really been factored into the way in which we approach conflict and in the way that we approach international security as we being a part of the international community.
Aidan, I wonder if you could speak maybe to the place of standard setting and international agreements.
Yeah, I mean, the challenge is the speed of the technological change is outpacing any ability for policy or regulation to stay up to speed. I mean, that doesn't mean that we don't try. We absolutely should try. We've got Toby Feakin, our cyber ambassador, working on norms inside the region. I mean, that is absolutely the right approach, but we really can't rely on it. It's just moving too fast.
Yeah. And Darren, how do sort of international negotiations, often backdoor, feed into the economics of technology integration? And
the GATT, which is the sort of the document that underlies the World Trade Organization, has an article which provides an exception for national security. And I imagine when the drafters were writing the document back in the 1940s, they weren't expecting that exception would be, ginormous today, and especially as asserted by the Trump administration. And so the risk is that exception is used, it becomes so broad as to give the rest of the document no meaning, because everything becomes about national security. And so I don't know what the answer is, but those who are interested in preserving those documents need to contribute some ideas for how to reframe what national security means, not just for domestic legislating, but to preserve these agreements. The other thing I'd quickly mention is that what was interesting about Minister Hawke's speech to me this morning was he explicitly acknowledged that Australian money was moving away from multilateral initiatives towards bilateral initiatives. And I think the balance between multilateralism and bilateralism is shifting towards bilateralism more and more. And that's interesting and has consequences.
Yeah. Okay. Just down the middle.
Hi there, my name's Gil, I'm from the ANU. A lot of the discussion on this panel has been about the exponential growth of technology and the failure of states to adapt. To this end, we've seen a number of cyber attacks and cyber weapons being used both by state and non-state actors, such as Russian influence attempts on the US elections and the WannaCry attacks. My question is it still possible for states to effectively protect their citizens and themselves from cyber attacks, and what implications does this have for interstate and intrastate relations?
Let me have a try. The answer is there's no guarantees in life other than, as they say, taxes and death. But the government can go a long way, and I think the Australian government is working really hard at this. So the fact that we've got cybersecurity out of the tech domain and into mainstream media, where society is aware of the risk, they may not necessarily know what they have to do beyond the basics, is a great step. So, no, I actually have a high degree of confidence. We, as a society, are moving forward. There is always more to do. If anything, I actually think often the challenges now is actually back to government itself and business, because they're now aware, every board in the country is aware of cybersecurity and it's a risk they have to manage. But they haven't broken it down into actionable steps that they can take. They still think of the black swan, the business implodes, all their data gets disclosed and they shut up shop and claim on insurance. That's good, that's one risk, right? But it's most unlikely to happen. It's breaking it down, and that's the thing that I think we're not doing well, making it simple to understand by business, by government, and then you will get individuals. I think the second bit, the government, one of the tricks that they haven't prosecuted as strong as they should be is the supply chain. At the end of the day, I just think about technology. The federal government is the #1 buyer of technology in this country. New South Wales government is #2, right? Etc. They can leverage that supply chain to influence the way industry thinks about cybersecurity. just like what they did with occupational health and safety. We all expect to be able to go to work and come home safely to our families. There's no reason why we can't leverage that same construct when we think about cybersecurity. It is happening, but it's slow. Human Services has done a little bit with Centrelink. If you're a vendor and you can access My Health records and Centrelink records, there's a set of security requirements, but there's so much more that can be done. So I have confidence, they just got to pick up speed.
If I could perhaps echo that, I think one of the things that public servants always feel bad about is that we don't get credit for our successes, and that actually a lot of the work that has been done has resulted in successes. But as anyone who's studied strategy knows, in that period before the Second World War, that the fear was that the bomber will always get through, that you could not create countermeasures for everything. So this, unfortunately, is the reality in which we exist. So it is I don't think there's any solution. I don't think that there's any black or white silver bullet that can be applied to the resolution of this. It is just a fundamental fact of life as we roll forward, that we need to appreciate the fact that the technology is going to continue to change, and that it's just not good enough to keep doing things the way we've always done things. We need to adapt to it.
I was at the WA Cybersecurity Awards, I think, on Friday night, and where I was a judge, and I was sitting at the table next to a bloke that is in cyber, and we were talking about how we first met in 2006, where I was a keynote speaker at a conference that he'd organised, and we're talking about how we're still talking about the same shit 13 years later. And so if you have a look at, like, if you think about security as a series of, like, Venn diagram, like a Venn diagram and a series of circles, you've got individual security, community security, state, international. And when we talk about cybersecurity, we tend to think, I still think in society it's thought about in this kind of techie way that, you know, there's this group of people somewhere, mostly, you know, blokes with glasses and not a lot of social skills working in the cyberspace. But I think that as a society we need to really get to, and we're yet to get to that space where we actually see cybersecurity as part of everyone's business, and understand that often the weakest link in any security system, is the human link. But it can also be the most resilient link in any security system as well. I think last year I did a talk to PwC and to their clients in cybersec, where they were the question was, how do we create this cybersecurity culture in organisations? And most organisations will have cybersecurity as a little bit of a checklist. Or you come in, you join the organisation, you do your online training, you do this thing, oh yeah, I know I have to change my password every 6 months, and my password has to have numerals and a capital letter and an exclamation mark, and all of that stuff. But that training actually doesn't create a cybersecure culture, and it actually doesn't change the behaviours. So we went through this thing about, actually how do you actually change behaviour, and it's not training. And you can have the best software and the best cybersecurity people on your team, but you can still have a breach because of the human link. So when I talk about cybersecurity to people, I often bring it back to that human link and raising the awareness and creating a cybersecurity culture where everybody plays a part in it.
Thank you. Down the front here.
Cheers, thanks. Brian Everingham. I'm becoming less and less secure by the minute. So I'd like to reflect instead upon something slightly more lightweight. To what extent has Twitter changed foreign policy?
Or the politician.
Who wants to have a go at that one?
I don't know if it's Twitter or if it's Trump. I think the way that politics is done has generally changed with the introduction of social media. I mean, even you think about Question Time, right? So Question Time, once it became broadcast and you had the 24-hour news cycle and then you have the introduction of social media, it's really actually changed politics generally. But I think that the thing with Twitter is you have a president who is so prolific on Twitter, you know, even at 4 a.m. in the morning, and it's that. But I don't know that it's changed foreign policy per se. I think that it's still an anomaly that he's so active on Twitter, and I think it's kind of seen in that context. Oh yeah, Trump on Twitter, you know. Not to downplay the impact of it, but you know, I think it's part of a broader kind of discussion about how social media and the changing media ecology has changed politics.
I would say we run a security operations centre, and in fact, you know, we secure 42% of the Commonwealth from hackers and viruses. And I would go, some of our information sources about the latest breach, you pick it up faster on Twitter than you will through the formal channels. So it's a channel you listen to if you want to be really zero day.
All right. So we'll go one over here, and then we have one over here.
What role do you think RegTech and FinTech has in our space in Australia? I'm surprised that I haven't actually heard anyone on the panel mention it, so I'm really keen to hear about that. And do you also think that...
Yeah, could you please state your name? Sorry.
Oh, sorry. My name's Genevieve Allen. I'm from the Department of Industry, Innovation and Science. And also just language around things like cybersecurity. Do you think in 10 years' time we'll laugh a little bit about how we've siloed that from just general security?
I think to answer your second question first, I think it will become just common vernacular, right? It used to be e-security, then it became cybersecurity. The only thing I'd say is this: the industry is not good at helping in clarity of language. You know, the problem is it's a hot topic. Every vendor out there talks about cybersecurity, which doesn't help in a vocabulary, but I think it will be just normal language. We won't be thinking about it in the future. As for fintech, look, it's probably a question more for the financial industry of how that's challenging and changing the norms in that world. I mean, clearly it's an example of how regulation struggles to keep up with technology, right? You think about, you know, we focus on the 4 banks with the Royal Commission, yet increasingly financial transactions are happening outside those 4 banks. If you look at what even's happening sort of in Europe, where they're trying to get, you know, payment mechanisms outside, you know, the US flows and the like, again, it just creates mayhem for the policy makers. But of course, as individuals, it gives us flexibility and choice and moves the economy forward. It also, I would suggest, probably my final comment is, when we think about Australia and how do we, you know, inject economic prosperity into our economy, it's another domain where we can stand for you know, and create jobs in the sense that we have great legal foundations. There's no reason why we can't be a fintech, you know, region of success, just like we should be for cybersecurity.
Darren, I wonder if I might ask you to maybe discuss fintech and the different financial ecosystems that are beginning to exist in the US and China, and how that's actually a border which is beginning to spread throughout the region.
Differing financial ecosystems. Can you explain what you mean by that?
I'm thinking Myanmar might be an example where they're beginning to operate purely on the Chinese financial fintech system through their various payment systems. Do you see that as another technological border that we need to be thinking about?
We're mostly out of my area of expertise. I mean, I would link back, you know, these platforms and systems, you know, back to the sort of the foundational economics behind them, and for Chinese systems to I think to spread, that's going to require a further internationalisation of the Chinese currency. And so while a few more transactions are being cleared in renminbi, there's still a lot that needs to happen before the currency is a truly international one. And I think that will place a ceiling. I read an article this morning which was talking about how the Chinese government is removing investment restrictions from the West into China. And the comment on Twitter was that, as goods trade and trade in movements of people are drying up, perhaps capital is going to be the one that continues to sort of deepen the interdependence between the two. But equally, as Alan mentioned this morning, there might be some restrictions placed upon investment. So I'm not sure that the technology is as powerful as the underlying sort of economics and structures behind it in this space. But.
Okay, thank you. One right down the front. Yeah.
Thanks, Alan Gingell. One of the oldest adages in security is know your enemy. But one of the striking things about the discussion that we've just had about cybersecurity is how obscure the enemy is. We get told that the enemy is either state actors, perhaps major state actors, or criminals, but nothing much beyond that. Now I know the attribution problem in all of this, but just as a general member of the public, I wondered whether you could say something more about who the enemy, this is probably to Aidan particularly, who the enemy is and how, or the enemies, and how it's changing.
Sure. Let me start with this comment, and I think Anne made the comment that comes back to an individual, right? And even if there is a state actor, organised crime, or just an individual trying to create some annoyances, there is an individual there somewhere. So certainly there is a lot of work in the industry about user behaviour analytics, trying to basically use big data to understand the next step that will be taken. And I'll give you an example that I guess we can all relate to in our work or private lives. One of the risks for a lot of businesses is you have a disgruntled employee who may take data sets with them as they leave. And so user behaviour analytics would be, for example, saying, well, what attributes or what data sets can I review that will tell me that an employee is disgruntled or may even be looking at leaving? And one of those, for example, is LinkedIn, it's the social media network where you have your profile up there. It is highly correlated that if you update your CV on LinkedIn, that you're in the market for a job. That is a flag to raise the security profile of that individual inside an organisation. And so while you then tune it and you then go, well, okay, now I want to see for those individuals the download of large data sets, and I may want to block it. Now I share that, let's call it non-military, as a way of saying that type of profiling is what is increasingly happening at the state and criminal organisation. How do you profile attributes or attack vectors, indicators of potential compromise? And there's a lot of work that's happening with data analytics there. The only asterisk I'd say, Alan, is with any big data set, if you create norms, it's just as you create those norms, the perpetrators will work out how to sit inside those norms.
I might add to that, sometimes the use of the language doesn't particularly help. I mean, that gentleman in Nigeria who keeps trying to get my account details is not the enemy.
Does he offer to marry you as well?
I've had that too. And send me all sorts of drugs, so it's quite extraordinary what's out there. I think we have to recognise...
What did you click on, Alan?
It's a new sphere for malign actors, and we, I think, need to be very careful about the language we use. There is, however, as you've referred to yourself a number of times, some real issues of non-declared conflicts being waged by either state actors or non-state actors, but some of those non-state actors have some of the characteristics of states nowadays. And if you run back 20-odd years to Senior Colonels Chow and Wang and their book Unrestricted War, they actually gave us a map to where we currently find ourselves. So while I wouldn't use necessarily the word enemies in many cases, in fact, I would actually step back from using it unless it actually was in the context of a declared conflict of some stage. I think I would use a variety of other languages with more precision to describe the actual nature of the activities that are being conducted by these people.
Can I just say most kind of large-scale cyber attacks will be conducted by states, but I think, in terms of coming back to the question about language as well, we now talk about cyber-enabled crime, cyber-enabled terrorism, for example. In 2016, a transnational jihadist organisation managed to hack into a database, get credit card information, and then sell that online, for bitcoins, managed to raise $600,000 for an attack. So, I think when we talk about cyber crime and cyber-enabled crime, that's a different category, to the kind of cybersecurity concerns around states hacking into organisations and around government as well.
Okay, so I've got 2 questions in the queue and we've got a few minutes remaining. So let's go with these and then see if we have any further time. So we've had one down here, very patiently waited. Second row from the front.
Hi, Judy Gao from Victoria Department of Transport. I have a question. Could you please candidly comment on Julian Assange? From any perspective is fine.
Open to the panel.
Was that me?
No, doesn't seem like there's any comments. Okay, so we have one.
Our silence spoke very loudly.
Yes, good afternoon. Peter Grulemans from the Sydney West Peace Group. I don't know this lady before today, but I'm a very strong supporter of Julian Assange. And my question has to do, as a matter of fact, with privacy issues and the government's need for transparency in its security measures and surveillance. You mentioned the exception for national security in your framing of policy towards surveillance and cybersecurity. How is that relevant for the government's refusal to follow transparency in the case of spying on East Timor, when it was simply negotiating an oil contract? That's not national security, is it? And the further prosecution of Bernard Collaery and Witness K. How is national security at issue here when East Timor was the origin of the problem? And my request to you then is whether your conscience will allow you to answer or whether you'll lose your job if you do, will you influence the government to show some leniency in the defendant's case when the government itself is cowering behind this so-called national security problem?
I think that one was to me. Look, to be perfectly honest, it's not an issue of conscience, it's an issue of standing. I just don't think it would be appropriate for me, running the Australian Civil Military Centre as I do, to make comment on something that really falls outside of my remit.
Any other comments from the panel? No? In that case, we do have an opportunity for a few more questions. So one over here.
Hi, my name's Sally. I'm from the Coral Bell School at NU. My question is about the developments in machine and deep learning algorithms that have allowed this technology to create deep fakes, or a lot of these algorithms can respond to messages independently. It can read a journal article and write its own abstract, and that's this advancement of this technology. And I find this really concerning, and I wonder about how the international community can approach this, or what policies can be put in place to better navigate this. We see Microsoft's president, Brad Smith's, come out with the idea of a digital Geneva Convention. Is this a good approach? Or, as you say, Alan, the genie's out of the bottle and we need to let it kind of dance for a while so we can navigate where these challenges are and how to better tackle them?
Yes. Look at me. Look, I think that's a fantastic question. One of the things that's really brought this all home to me is when I do my tax every year. Some 5-10 years ago, I would sit down and it was a painful process involving lots of pieces of paper and forms and filling stuff out. It takes me about 5 minutes nowadays as I hop on in, enter some data, the system knows everything, push the button, and hey-ho, I owe the government more money. That's the world we all live in. But as you say, I mean, it is amazing some of the very simple technologies that are out there that are available online that can generate all sorts of things for you. I hope I'm not being flippant by saying that the genie's out of the bottle, but I am suggesting that we are going to have to get used to it. And one of the things I think that is most important for us, certainly in government, and I think it actually is as true for the private sector, is that in the good old days we worked in a sort of linear mindset. We went to school, we went to university, we got a degree, we entered the workforce, we worked 35 odd years and then we retired. That's simply not going to answer anymore. We need to invest an awful lot more in our people to ensure that they're capable of adjusting to all these new challenges that come swinging out at them. Back in 1987, my doctoral supervisor suggested to me that I might have to learn a computer, and I looked at him and went, as if that's ever going to happen. And that was one example. The reality is now that I'm having to master new apps and new technologies on a daily basis, and I'm incredibly poorly equipped to do so. So my suggestion is, again, we have to change the way that we approach our careers, our educational system, the way we do work, the degree to which we invest in our people, in whatever organisation that we've got, that we don't just sort of bring them in and say, look, you've got a background in international relations, economics, law, we're going to fire you down that bearing and that's what you're going to do for the end of your days, but rather that you're going to have to surf this multidisciplinary world that we find ourselves in. We'll use you for your expertise, but accept the fact that you're going to need new expertise as you move through your career.
Yeah, a bit I'd add. I mean, obviously there's the good part, as Alan's mentioned, of technology. I was just reflecting as you're making that comment, and you mentioned Microsoft, and for many in the room, you'll remember Clippy. Clippy was that little paper clip down in the bottom right-hand corner that knew better than you as to what you needed to do next. And I use that as an example, obviously early AI, but how we really need to get it right if we're going to actually improve our life. But I think the other bit I would throw into your question is there's obviously increasingly large data sets being stored about who we are as individuals, who we are as businesses, government, society, nations at large. And I made that comment earlier that data is often called the new currency. And it's who has access to it, where is it located? And it's not just whether it leaves Australia, but rather who is reaching it? And one of the dimensions that our industry is wrestling with now, the technology industry at the moment, is while we may store the records, if say yourself, we may store the records about you here in Australia, who can access it? And in ICT, we have what we call follow the sun model. So engineers around the world, when it's midnight here, someone in maybe China, Bangalore, or Middle East will do the support. The problem with that is to do the support, they get almost unfettered access to those databases. And I use that just as one example to say that stream of who can really access your records, the country's records, is still to be played out. It's probably fair to say it's in the media now every couple of weeks. The Cloud Act, where we're doing a bilateral agreement with the US, is part of that conversation. So I think I would throw that on as the new frontier. Who can access the data that they're storing about you as an individual?
And on that note, we are out of time. So there's afternoon tea outside, and the next panel, The Health of the Planet, will convene at 3:30. But please join me in thanking the panel.